Ever wonder who's really pulling the strings in the business world? Well, understanding who actually holds the purse strings can completely flip how you look at the modern market. Today in this explainer, we're decoding the hidden mechanics of buyer bargaining power. If you've ever watched massive companies dictate the rules of the game to their suppliers and thought, how do they get away with that? Get ready to completely shift your perspective.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap. We'll start with the 5 forces context, then jump into defining buyer power. From there, we'll look at leverage, specifically the lot order, then the price sensitivity factor. After that, we'll look at real-world buyer power and wrap up with how to assess your own buyer threat.
First up, the 5 forces context.
You're probably already familiar with Michael Porter's legendary 5 forces model. Businesses are basically in a pressure cooker, right? They're getting squeezed from all sides. You've got the threat of new entrants dropping in, suppliers squeezing you from one end, substitute products creeping up from another, and of course, competitive rivalry right dead in the center. But today, we are zooming in exclusively on that specific pressure point coming from the bottom: the customers, the buyers.
Moving right along to defining buyer power. So what is the bargaining power of buyers, really? Simply put, it's the ability of customers to exert intense competitive pressure on an industry. They essentially force down prices or demand better terms and higher quality. Now, let's dispel a super common myth right out of the gate. When we talk about buyers in the strategic sense, we are not talking about you and me grabbing a candy bar off a shelf. Individual consumers rarely move the needle. What we're actually talking about here are massive corporate buyers, giant retail chains, and huge distributors who can systematically squeeze an entire industry's profits just because of their absolute sheer size. Which brings us to leverage, and specifically the lot order.
There's a really crucial distinction here that gets mixed up all the time: goal versus ability. Look, every buyer's goal is obviously better pricing, maybe higher quality or extended payment terms. But simply having a goal doesn't just magically grant you power, right? The actual mechanism that gives a buyer the real authority to demand concessions is the lot order. When a buyer purchases in massive, sweeping volumes, their business becomes absolutely critical to that supplier's survival. It's the sheer size of the lot order that hands the buyer their leverage. It's the ultimate trump card.
Now, what's really interesting is how certain conditions act like a multiplier for that leverage. A buyer's power absolutely peaks when they are large and few in number, meaning the poor supplier has almost no alternative customers to pivot to. This power also spikes if the products being bought are totally standardized or undifferentiated. I mean, if a buyer is just purchasing basic commodities, they can easily pit suppliers against each other. Boom, prices drop. Plus, if it costs the buyer almost nothing to switch to a competing brand, they hold all the cards. And finally, knowledge is power. When buyers are highly informed about the seller's actual production costs, they know exactly how far they can squeeze the price down before the supplier literally goes bankrupt.
Next up, let's talk about the price sensitivity factor.
So why do some buyers fight tooth and nail over literal pennies, while others just happily pay a premium? Well, it all comes down to price sensitivity. First off, if a buyer is operating on incredibly tight profit margins themselves, you can bet they're going to aggressively squeeze their suppliers just to survive. Second, think about the proportion of costs. If an input makes up a massive fraction of the buyer's total expenses, they are going to care intensely about its price. A classic example, soft drink companies. They are hypersensitive to the cost of aluminum cans because packaging is a huge expense for them. On the flip side, they probably aren't haggling over the cost of the paper clips they use at corporate HQ. It's a drop in the bucket. Lastly, if the purchased input doesn't significantly change the quality of the buyer's final product, there is zero loyalty. They'll just hunt for the absolute lowest price out there.
Let's bring this to life. Section 5. Real-world buyer power.
Think about the transactions happening globally, all around us, every single day. What does this incredible leverage actually look like out in the wild when billions of dollars are on the line? Let's dive into a few fascinating case studies.
Take the Starbucks strategy, for example. If a tiny, independent local cafe wants to buy coffee beans, they have practically zero negotiating power. They just take the market price. But Starbucks? They commit to absolutely huge lot orders, buying millions of pounds of coffee beans annually. Because of this monumental volume, they are the lifeblood of their agricultural suppliers. That sheer size grants Starbucks the incredible leverage to heavily influence market prices and dictate strict terms, quality standards, and even delivery schedules to the growers.
Then you have retail giants and massive supermarkets. Companies like Walmart or major grocery chains don't just buy products. They are the gatekeepers to the end consumer.
Their access to a vast consumer base is so insanely valuable that they actually have the power to charge the manufacturers. Yes, you heard that right. They demand promotional allowances and huge lump sum payments, known as slotting fees, simply for the privilege of putting a product on their shelves. The manufacturer needs the supermarket way more than the supermarket needs any single manufacturer.
Here's another super impactful one from the healthcare sector. When you or I go to a hospital as an individual patient, we have zero, and I mean zero, ability to negotiate the price of a surgery or a procedure. But health maintenance organizations, or HMOs, they purchase healthcare services in massive bulk on behalf of thousands and thousands of members. Because they represent such a huge concentrated block of potential patients, they use that sheer size to negotiate rates with hospitals and doctors that are drastically lower than anything a standard patient would see.
And this brilliantly illustrates one of the most aggressive tactics of all, the threat of backward integration. Imagine a massive buyer who relies heavily on a supplier for a key input. To gain absolute, total leverage, the buyer can simply threaten to start manufacturing that input themselves. Historically, major beer companies like Anheuser-Busch and Coors did exactly this. They partially integrated backward into metal can manufacturing. Basically, by proving they could just make their own cans, they completely terrified their traditional metal can suppliers into dropping prices and granting major concessions just to keep whatever was left of the business.
Finally, let's zoom back out. Assessing your buyer threat.
Bringing it all together, the crucial lesson really becomes clear when we balance price sensitivity against bargaining power. Relying heavily on just a handful of massive buyers is a major strategic vulnerability for any business. If your buyers can easily flip to a competitor, if your product isn't highly differentiated, or if your buyers place lot orders so huge that your entire business basically relies on them to keep the lights on, well, you're at their mercy. And they absolutely will use that leverage to continually erode your long-term profitability.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought to really chew on. Who really holds the power in your next transaction? Whether you're buying or selling, market dynamics and the subtle, hidden mechanics of leverage dictate who truly controls the purse strings. Always look past the stated goals and start analyzing the underlying ability to exert pressure. Keep learning, stay focused, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.